Coming in at number 10 is the Colonial Parkway Killer. An active criminal between 1986 to 1989, this person specifically targeted couples traveling Virginia's scenic parkway late at night. During that time, 3 couples were found dead and 1 couple went missing but is presumed to have the same fate. A different couple was found each year, leading authorities to question, was this person only killing once a year, or were this just the ones they found? The cases had received major media coverage, including documentaries, news articles, and TV shows as recent as 2021, but despite having over 130 suspects, the FBI have yet to be able to put a name to the face of the crimes. One bizarre piece of this puzzle is that in 2010, a note was discovered in a box taken years earlier from one of the victims' apartments. The note stated that she was to meet someone in a blue van at a rest stop, and when the Virginia State Police was asked about this, they claimed that the note had been previously examined. But in 1989, during the time of the murders, an investigator involved told case reporters that he was unaware of the existence of the note. So, if you ever find yourself driving the scenic route of Virginia, do yourself a favor and don't make a pit stop. Next up at number 9 is Glenn Stewart Godwin. In 1996, this killer was added to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's top 10 most wanted list after he escaped from a California prison back in 1987. At the time of his escape, he was serving a 26 to life sentence for the death of Kim LaValle. Trying to hide the body, took her up a mountain and decided to use a homemade explosive in an attempt to make the remains disappear. However, residents of the mountain only a few months later came across some remains, thus sparking his arrest. When he escaped prison in 1987, he fled to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico and joined up with a cartel, but was found and convicted in 1991 and sent to jail in Guadalajara. It was here that he took the life of a fellow inmate and then escaped a second time only 5 months later. Authorities have yet to track him down after 31 years, but it is believed that he is still on the loose today. So keep your eyes peeled if you're ever in Latin America, because the FBI is offering a $20,000 reward for anyone with information that could lead to his arrest. Next up at number 8 is Bible John. Active between 1968 and 1969 in Glasgow, Scotland, the man nicknamed Bible John is believed to be responsible for the death of 3 young women. All 3 of his victims were young brunettes who he would lure in at a local dance hall in the city. The unidentified criminal is referred to as Bible John as, according to a key witness, saw a man who picked up women yet quoted extensively from the Old Testament and frowned on adultery. But of course, taking the lives of young women seemed alright in his books. For decades, the Glasgow police have tirelessly searched for the monster, but have remained unsuccessful in tracking him down. To date, the search for Bible John has been the most extensive manhunt in Scotland criminal history. It was also the first time in Scotland's history that a composite drawing of the perpetrator was allowed and publicized in an attempt to get more information from the public. Although there have been a few suspects over the years, none have been convicted, and to this day it is unknown who is responsible for these horrible attacks. Next up at number 7 is the Monster of Florence. Active between 1968 and 1985 in Florence, Italy, this man is responsible for the death of 8 young couples who he would target while they snuck away into the woods trying to be intimate outside of their homes. Now, in 1970s Italy, this could be a common occurrence, as it was customary for young couples to not live with each other until marriage, and with nowhere else to go, sometimes the great outdoors was their only alternative. The part about this that really gets under your skin is that the female victims would be found mutilated, with their intimate areas removed with, quote, a surgical precision that led police to believe he had a medical background. More than 100,000 men were investigated for these crimes, with some being arrested or even tried, but eventually another killing would occur, exonerating them and forcing police to continue their search. The search continued for this gruesome monster, and a local farmer named Pietro Pacini was convicted in 1994 for 6 of the killings, but later in 1996 it was overturned. Pacini then died a few years later, but it is strongly believed he did not work alone, and while 5 accused men have been sent to jail at one point or another, they were all eventually released, leaving this case wide open with the alleged convict running free. Coming in at number 6, we have the upstairs lounge fire. In June of 1973, a New Orleans gay bar was the victim of the second worst attack on the American queer community, only surpassed in 2016 by the Pulse nightclub massacre. The upstairs lounge was a beloved hub with drag queens and music, but sadly on this 1973 Pride weekend, everything would change. The bar was located on the second floor of the building, and out of nowhere patrons started to smell gasoline, but initially thought nothing of it. A few minutes later, a doorbell rang, and when someone opened to see who was there, a fireball was thrown into the room and immediately erupted the room into an inferno. It is now known the perpetrator used a Molotov cocktail. The fire burned fast, lasting only 20 minutes, but in that time 32 lost their lives and another 15 were severely injured by the attack. The survivors of the fire were taken to identify the bodies of those who died in the tragedy, but according to one survivor, many of the identified bodies remained unclaimed by family members as they were ashamed and wanted nothing to do with their gay kin. After the attacks, many survivors refused to show their faces, afraid of the homophobia that would follow due to the media coverage. No arrests were ever made, and it's very likely that whoever committed this atrocity continues to walk the streets of New Orleans to this day. Next up at number 5, the Stoneman. Active between the years of 1985 to 1988 in Mumbai, India, this mysterious criminal was never caught. Believed to be responsible for the death of 26 people, the Stoneman got their name due to their cruel methods. The Stoneman would target homeless people sleeping alone on the streets at night and used concrete blocks or stones, sometimes weighing up to 65 pounds to carry out their gruesome plan. According to the media, 12 people died at the hands of the Stoneman in Mumbai, India between 1985 to 1988, and then they moved to Calcutta where another 12 people were found dead in a single year. Now, it's not known for sure if the Calcutta killer was the same as whoever committed the atrocities in Mumbai. Authorities did mention it could have been a copycat, but most seem to believe it was all one person, or at least a group of people working together. No one has been charged for any of the crimes, and all remain unsolved. Coming in at number 4, the Doodler. This next criminal was from San Francisco and active for just 1 year between 1974 to 1975. However, in that year, the unidentified killer is believed to have taken 16 lives. He was known to target specifically white men in gay clubs and got his name as he was known to sit around doodling pictures of them to draw them in. Once they got to talking, he would lure them elsewhere, like a lake or a park, and follow through with the rest of his evil plan. Unfortunately, due to the rampant homophobia of the time, when police did find a suspect for the case, they couldn't proceed with criminal charges, as none of the 3 surviving victims of the brutal attacks felt safe to out themselves publicly by testifying in court, fearful of how the consequences might impact their daily lives. The case remains open with no known suspect of who committed the crimes, and in 2019 the police offered a $100,000 reward to anyone with more information of the killer. Next up at number 3, the Craigslist Ripper. Also known as the Long Island Killer, this man is thought to be responsible for the death of 17 people between the years of 1996 to 2010, and got his name as he was known to target women of the night who advertised their services on Craigslist. Although his crimes began in 1996, none of his victims were found until 2010, many wrapped up in sacks or garbage bags along the Long Island shore. It's speculated that he may have been, or that he currently is, a police officer, as whoever committed these crimes seemed to have an in-depth knowledge of the investigation techniques not typically known by just anyone. Sadly, of the 17 found, only 5 have been able to be properly identified due to the nature of how he left the bodies. Coming in at number 2, the Zodiac Killer. Possibly the most famous repeat convict known to date, this criminal is as scary as it gets. Active in California during the late 60s and early 70s, the Zodiac Killer seemed to get off on the chase, sending in letters and highly encrypted clues to the police that supposedly would reveal his identity, and more, if only the puzzles could be deciphered. Not only would he send in cards to the police, but he was known to mail in his taunting clues to local newspapers, threatening awful consequences if they were not printed. There are 7 known victims that he is known to be responsible for, 2 surviving his brutal attacks, although he claims to have killed 37. The especially creepy part about this particular monster is that, as detailed in his letters, he believed that all those whose life he ended would become his slaves in the afterlife, and that he would be sent to paradise. Although the Zodiac ceased all written communication by 1974, the case remained open since 1969, with no known perpetrator. And last up in our number 1 spot, Issei Sagawa. Nicknamed the Kobe Cannibal, this monster is not for the faint of heart. Now, unlike others on the list, he's only known for one brutal attack, but what he did will leave you speechless. Sagawa was born in Japan and says he had known since childhood of his gruesome instincts, but for whatever reason would always back out of his desires at the last second. All of this changed, however, when he moved to Paris to pursue his PhD. It was there that he met Renee Hartvelt, one of his classmates who he decided was the right victim. Sagawa says he picked her due to her beauty and stature, as he saw himself as weak, ugly, and small, and believed that he could absorb her energy. He invited her over on the pretense of a dinner, but knew all along what he planned to do. He had it thought out. He took the woman's life, and I'm sure you can imagine what he did with her body, considering the monster's name. After 4 days, the body began to decompose, and he knew that he had to get her out of his apartment or risk being arrested for his crimes. However, he was caught attempting to dispose of her remains in a nearby lake by French authorities and was, of course, arrested immediately. After awaiting trial for 2 years, a judge ruled him legally insane and unfit for trial, ordering him to live out the rest of his life in a mental institution. He was deported out of France and sent back to Japan, where he was immediately committed. But here's where it gets crazy. Once in this institution, the psychologist deemed him fully sane, and that his perversions were the reason for his crimes, not insanity. But since his charges had been dropped while in France, all documents were sealed and nothing was sent to Japanese authorities, meaning that legally, the institution could not detain him any longer. After only 2 years away from society, Sagawa walked out freely and remains free to this day. Coming in at number 10, the Eastbound Strangler. Back in 2006, one fateful night, this monster took the life of 4 women and was never seen from again. The Eastbound Strangler targeted 4 New Jersey escorts and left them behind the Golden Key Motel, face down, in a row, facing east and about 60 feet apart from each other. The victims were left fully clothed, minus having their socks and shoes removed, and all appeared to have been killed in the same way. Early on, there was speculation that it could have been linked to the Long Island Killer, another unknown attacker, but it was later ruled out by investigators. Despite 15 years of investigation, they have never been able to come close to any leads, and whoever was responsible has never been caught, and the $25,000 reward remains unclaimed. Next up at number 9, the Texas Killing Field. Now, what would seem like a normal 25-acre patch of land just off the highway near Houston, Texas, is actually a haunting field where more than 30 bodies have been found since the early 1970s. Nearly all of the victims found have been young women and girls, and there are apparently many more missing women from the area, but no remains beyond the 30 victims have ever been recovered. Despite the authorities' best effort, it is unknown how many perpetrators have actually contributed to this field, though it's suspected that more than one person is responsible. To date, only 3 of the cases have been successful in convicting an attacker, and the remaining 27 remain unsolved, with no leads and no luck of where to turn next. In 2011, a film entitled Texas Killing Fields was made about the series of crimes associated with the notorious plot of land, but it was not received well, and unfortunately did not kickstart anything more than upset families of the victims and a few false confessions to the atrocities. Coming in at number 8, the Flat Tire Murderer. Active between 1975 to 1976, this monster is believed to have been responsible for between 12 to 35 deaths, though the exact number is still unknown. The perpetrator got his name as allegedly he would offer to help women traveling alone who had gotten a flat tire, but unbeknownst to them, it was the attacker who had deflated their tires in the first place. While not all victims followed this exact formula, it was certainly the method for the first of his 2 victims. Bodies of the victims were found dumped into canals, while their cars were found abandoned miles away. Authorities believe the cause of their deaths to have been from drowning, and were all found with signs of being taken advantage of prior to their death. Over the years, with no culprits being found for these vicious attacks, some have suggested it could have been the work of notorious Ted Bundy, but that's merely speculation and has no evidence to back it up. For all we know, the flat tire murderer remains on the loose. Coming in at number 7, the Honolulu Strangler. Credited with being responsible for the death of 5 women, this unidentified killer was active only between 1985 to 1986 and was never caught. The sadistic perpetrator was known to target women, but that seems to be where the links stop. All of his victims were brutally attacked and taken advantage of, and then left tied up on the street to be found by police. Authorities took this case very seriously, as at the time it was the first known repeat criminal of his kind in Honolulu. Local authorities put together a 27-person task force, but even with all that manpower, they were never able to find the attacker. There was hope when a man named Howard Gay was arrested, as he seemed to fit the profile, but he was eventually released after further interrogation. Years later, in 2017, the case was covered by a true crime podcast, and once again in 2022, but despite its popularity, we have no idea what happened to the Honolulu Strangler. Next up at number 6, the West Mesa Bone Collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar, a human bone. Little did she know, she'd actually stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. Nicknamed the West Mesa Bone Collector, this killer was active between 2001 and 2005 and was a truly sick man. He was known to target young women, usually Hispanic, and almost always involved in late night services or with connections to the drug trade, but not exclusively, making it hard to identify just why he chose the victims he did. The thing is, during 2001 to 2005, there were reportedly more missing persons than usual, but I guess the New Mexico police didn't feel much need to dive into the disappearance of women involved in this type of work. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he is responsible for the deaths and that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Police and FBI have never been able to track down who is responsible for ending these young women's lives, and the monster remains on the loose. Coming in at number 5, the Frankford Slasher. Between 1985 and 1990, this monster preyed upon women in a rough neighborhood in Philadelphia. The Frankford Slasher was known for being incredibly violent, mutilating the victims' bodies past recognition. What was designed to be on the inside of the body, like organs and muscle tissue, would often end up exposed, and then after having his way with the victims, he would leave them on the street, strategically posed for when the police would find them. Believed to be responsible for the death of 9 women, the Frankford Slasher targeted specifically white women, usually ladies of the night, with a public history of mental illness. But oddly, the ages of the victims ranged from 28 all the way to 68. One man, Leonard Christopher, was convicted of one of the crimes in 1990, but more happened once he was put away, causing concern that maybe they'd found the wrong man. Further, significant questions have popped up regarding the quality of evidence they used to convict Christopher, Christopher. He apparently did not match witness reports of the white man seen with other victims, leaving many in fear that the Frankford slasher remains uncaught and unidentified. Next up at number 4, the Chicago Strangler. Between 2001 to 2018, a reported 75 Chicago women all lost their lives the same way, suffocation. But it wasn't until 2019 that a task force was made to try and stop these killings from happening. Originally, authorities denied that there was any link of the crimes and denied it all being one person committing them, hence the delay in gathering a task force. But after an article from the Chicago Tribune ran in 2018, they were forced to admit that it was in fact a distinct possibility. As was uncovered in the 2018 article, there was in fact a few distinct links between the crimes. All the victims were women, all the victims were killed the same way, and nearly all the victims were black. Coincidence or not, the optics were very bad, as it seemed the authorities were not taking the death of black women seriously, and the task force was created. Then in 2021, a docu-series on Discovery Plus began streaming, and though activists were demanding answers from the Chicago Police Department, they still maintained they could neither confirm nor deny if the killings were from a repeat convict. We still have no clue who killed these women, and they still remain out in the world walking free. Next up at number 3, the I-70 killer. You wouldn't think the shopping mall off the highway would be a dangerous place to be or get a job, but in the spring of 1992, it very well could have been. 30 years ago, along the Interstate 70, or I-70, an unidentified man was responsible for the death of 6 store clerks who all had the same thing in common. They all worked in a shop off the same highway, they were all brunettes with long hair, and they were mostly all women. Except for one man, but he too had long hair and wore a ponytail, and police suspected the killer mistook him for a woman from behind. The attacker oddly didn't seem too interested in anything but taking their lives, as he rarely robbed the stores after, and if he did, he would maybe take $100. After one of the attacks, a customer actually walked in the store and caught him, the 2 victims on the floor, and the attacker still with the weapon in his hand. But fearing for his life, he ran away as fast as he could, and in shock, didn't call the authorities until nearly an hour later, well after the man had escaped the scene. A few years later, in 1994 Texas, 2 similar attacks took place, and then again in 2001 Indiana. The cases have been featured on America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and Dark Minds, but the man has never been caught and remains walking among us to this day. Coming in at number 2, Hercules. While some say killer, others say vigilante. This perpetrator separates themselves from the rest. The distinction between Hercules and, say, the Frankford slasher? Well, Hercules only attacks those who have already committed a brutal crime. Or rather, one very specific brutal crime, taking advantage of women. In 2019, 3 men were found in Bangladesh, each shot and each with a note tied around their neck. While not identical, all the notes followed the same structure. First stating the name of the victim whose neck the note was wrapped around, followed by the name of the victim who they had attacked. It would then explain that this was the fate of those who committed this crime and that others should beware. Signed, Hercules. Law enforcement has yet to uncover who is responsible for these deaths, but have no clue if the killings are by one person or a group of people. It sure has sparked debate, with many questioning who the real bad guy is here. And last up today at number 1, Pedro Lopez. Nicknamed the Monster of Andes, Pedro Lopez might be one of the most notorious criminals alive. After being kicked out of his childhood home at just 8 years old for taking advantage of his younger sister, Lopez was evicted and sent to live the rest of his childhood on the streets of Colombia. According to Lopez, not long after he was thrown out, he was abducted and assaulted, and then by 13 was taken in by a family, but after 2 years ran away. By 1978, Lopez claims to have been responsible for the death of 100. That same year, an indigenous tribe caught him and was going to execute him, but a nearby missionary took pity on him and demanded they release him and call him into the authorities. The police, however, for whatever reason, promptly released him from custody. From there, he fled to Colombia once again, followed by Ecuador, where he reports to have attacked about 3 girls a week, and when he was caught and arrested in 1980, he confessed to killing 200 100 victims, but there's suspicion that it could have been worse, as many as 360. Though he did remain jailed for 14 years, in 1994 he was released from prison for good behavior and sent back to Colombia to serve the rest of his sentence in a psychiatric facility. But only 4 years later, in 1998, he was ruled legally sane and released on a $50 bail. Rather predictably, he fled the country after his release, and a warrant for his arrest was promptly released. His whereabouts remain a mystery, and no one knows if he has committed any more attacks since he vanished.
The youngest guy currently on the FBI top 10 list, we have Alejandro Rosales Castillo at number 9. He is an American criminal that is only 17 years old, and he killed a 23-year-old woman. That woman was someone Alejandro dated. This teenager is very dangerous. The murder took place in Charlotte, North Carolina back in 2016. And ever since then, the police and the FBI are unable to track this kid down. Number 8, do you guys remember Kony 2012? Well, Joseph Kony is known as the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army that is responsible for abducting as many as 2 million people. Is this real life right now? Kony also forced some of these children to kill their own parents. Well, the war against Kony started in 2012. $800 million was spent to try to track this man down, but over the years there was no successful to kill or capture this man. There was a YouTube video talking in detail about who Kony was and the massive problem happening in our society because of this man. The video was titled Kony 2012 and it currently has over 100 million views.
Alright, moving on to number 7 now, we have Jason Derek Brown. This fugitive from LA has been on the FBI's most wanted list since July 2007 for a first-degree murder and armed robbery that occurred 3 years prior. In 2004, Robert Keith Palomares, a 24-year-old armored truck guard, was carrying the weekend deposits outside a theater in Phoenix. At 10 AM, Brown ambushed him with a gun, shooting him in the head 5 times. Brown then took a bag containing $56,000 in cash and fled down an alley on a bicycle. Palomares was transported to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. Within a week, police had issued an arrest warrant for Brown. He fled to Nevada, then California, then Oregon before disappearing completely off the grid. Police have 200 leads about where he might be, although they often conflict with each other. He could be in the US, Canada, or even France or Thailand. The FBI is now offering up to $200,000 for information leading to his capture.
Alright, moving on to number 4 now, we have John Patrick Hannan, who is actually known as the world's most successful prison fugitive who has been on the run for the past 60 years. That's a 6-0. John Hannan was just 22 years old when he was arrested and put into jail. He was sentenced for 21 months behind bars for stealing a car and assaulting 2 police officers. But he was able to break out of the facility just 30 days after. This guy is either a super genius or just a big dum-dum. I say super genius because he was able to be on the run for the past 60 years. And I say he's a big dum-dum because who escapes from prison when you only have to serve a 21-month sentence? Good behavior might even have gotten him out earlier, who knows?
Next up, number 3 now, we have Semyon Mogilovich. This Ukrainian-born man is a Russian mafia boss, or rather, he is the boss of bosses. He is at the helm of most Russian mafia syndicates in the world. His vast empire has resulted in the FBI referring to him as the most dangerous mobster in the world. Mogilovich is involved in weapons trafficking, contract murders, extortion, trafficking on an international scale. He hasn't lived a very secretive life either, and his homes and private life are all there to see on his Wikipedia page. The problem for international law enforcement is how well connected and protected he is. In 2006, former Russian Secret Service member Alexander Litvinenko alleged that Mogilovich had a good relationship with a Russian president known as Vladimir Putin. Litvinenko was assassinated via radiation poisoning not long after that allegation. He used to be on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, but was removed back in 2015. This is because the USA and Russia doesn't actually have an extradition treaty, meaning Russia is not obliged to hand him over to the US if they do catch him, basically making him untouchable. Next up at number 2 now, we have Shane O'Brien. He's a suspected killer who has been on the run for 2 years from UK police. He's now on Interpol's worldwide most wanted list. The 30-year-old is alleged to have murdered 21-year-old Josh Hanson in an unprovoked knife attack in a bar in West London in 2015. According to witnesses, O'Brien removed an item from his coat pocket and plunged it into Josh's neck. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A £50,000 reward is now being offered for any information leading to his prosecution. He's described as white, 6 feet tall, with grey eyes, dark brown hair, a full beard, and a tattoo on his back of an owl holding a skull.
Starting us off at number 10, Rashad Hawkins. He may not be evil, but he certainly isn't innocent. Rashad Hawkins was attending child support court and was sentenced to serve some time due to his negligence and failure to pay. Now, instead of doing the time or paying what he owed, Rashad decided running was the route he was gonna take. Before he was even taken into custody, Hawkins managed to evade authorities by jumping over a second-story railing and fleeing the building before they could catch him. He stayed on the run for 20 days before eventually being caught and now faces charges of criminal trespassing, assault, and evading arrest. So all in all, he made it much worse on himself. Next up at number 9, Nicholas Garrison. Arrested with several drug charges back in 2020, Nicholas tried his luck and made a run while in the courthouse. Out of nowhere, he manages to escape the grasps of the sheriffs detaining him and bolts, pushing past others in the courthouse, with the sheriffs chasing after him close behind. Once outside of the chamber, he headed for the staircase, at which point the sheriff made a leaping dive down the stairs head first to try and catch him, ultimately breaking a few ribs and getting a concussion. Garrison managed to escape him and sprinted down the stairs as fast as he could. He was later found in a motel and arrested, and now faces far worse charges than his original 6 months. Next up at number 8, Mysterious Man. Now, unfortunately, I could not find the name of this escapee. All that I know is that he was from Washington, so if you know his name, leave it below in the comments. The mystery man took off his prison uniform while still in the courtroom, which I can only assume was empty. But if that was the case, why was a convict left alone in the first place? Whatever, that's not the point. Now, stripped of his uniform and semi-blending in with the civilians in the courthouse, he bolts straight out the front door, running past many witnesses. Although from what I can tell on the blurry footage, it does look like he was running barefoot, which, I don't know, that's kind of clue number 2 for me. People aren't generally running around barefoot in a courthouse with good news, but hey, what do I know? Anyways, he was found a few hours later and put back into custody, and like every other person on this list, things were much worse from there on out for him. And next up at number 7, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard. I'm gonna go out on a limb here with little to no evidence of this being fact, but I'm gonna guess that most courtroom judges aren't starting off their day expecting to have to run around chasing delinquents down a flight of stairs. Well, whether Judge Buzzard saw it coming or not, this is exactly what his day entailed, when 2 young men, Tanner Jacobson and Cody Howard, came into his courtroom on October 16th, 2018. The 2 men made a run for it straight out of the courtroom, still in their handcuffs, and the judge quickly shed his robe and bolted right after them, chasing them down 4 flights of stairs, all the while yelling, "Stop, stop, you're only making this worse." But still they continued. Buzzard only managed to catch Howard, but Jacobson didn't make it much further before being caught by authorities after just a few blocks outside. They should have listened to the judge, because they did indeed make it much worse. Next up at number 6, Leonid Gracier. In 2019, Leonid was convicted for killing his younger sister, and upon his arrest told authorities Satan had demanded him. Well, it wouldn't be the first time we've heard that excuse. Seemingly unfazed by what he had committed, he was put into custody in Moscow, where apparently it's common to put prisoners into these boxes to detain them. Perhaps what they seemed to forget was handcuffs, however, as the killer tried to escape the confines by crawling up into the ceiling of the courthouse. He was nearly successful, but didn't manage to get very far before police tased him and pulled him back down from the ceiling. During his confession, he said he didn't regret his actions and essentially that he stood by his crimes and said that he had made everything better in doing them. So while he didn't technically succeed in his escape, I think we can all agree that we're glad that's the case. Coming in at number 5, a helping hand. Like most things in life, things are easier with the help of your friends. But unfortunately in this case, Callum was a 21-year-old helping his teenage friend escape a 5-month jail sentence. At first the teen was just convicted for stealing a cell phone and for whatever reason decided his best option was to make a break for it. Bailiffs went after him but weren't actually too worried at first as the door to exit required someone to push a button on the other side of it for it to open. Well, little did they know he had someone to do that very job. The accomplice, Callum Finter, ended up also being arrested for helping the teen escape, but he tried to claim that it was a total accident and he didn't mean to push the button. I don't know, but it seems pretty intentional to me looking at the footage there. This story didn't seem to win over anyone and he was ultimately sentenced to 3 months in jail for aiding his friend in his escape. The teen was on the run for 2 days but was later found and ended up having another 6 months added to his sentence. Have you ever heard the saying, not all help is good help? Just saying, it might have been something to think about before getting caught up in all this mess. Next up at number 4, Quantrell Schwartzlow. This piece of work was under arrest for some brutal domestic violence and despite that, was still left alone. Now, I don't know what it is about leaving criminals alone for a minute, especially those that are committed for some serious and dangerous crimes, but it just seems to me like once they are in custody, they should be continuously observed. Well, as you guessed it, Quantrell should have been kept under a closer watch. Though he was handcuffed, that didn't seem to stop him from escaping out of a window in an interrogation room in what can only be described as a swan dive out of the building. How he managed it, I don't quite understand. How he didn't break every bone in his body on the way down, also a mystery. But luckily he was caught about 3 hours later hiding out at a friend's house and was eventually charged not only for his escape but also the unruly crimes he committed on his girlfriend. Next up at number 3, Christopher Lee Ruffin. Back in 2012, while appearing in court for a probation violation, Christopher was sentenced to another 90 days in jail. Now, I don't know what he was originally charged for or any of the details of his case, but all in all, 90 days doesn't seem like it's as bad as it could get. But apparently it was still too much for Christopher. His runaway is especially wild to me because it's not just that he managed to escape, but he was actually tased by 2 of the bailiffs and still managed to continue running while being tased. He then ran past security and straight out the front door. In the next few hours, he tried to get multiple rides, threatening strangers to drive him out of town, but the police ended up catching up to him and took him back to jail. Now, this is just a wild guess, but I have a feeling he was looking at more than 90 days after the shenanigans he pulled. Coming in at number 2, Deontay Rosales. In 2014, this convict was arrested for the burglary and killing of a woman named Jill Sue, for which he claimed he was being framed. Well, as he puts it, to prove his innocence, he decided to escape the courthouse with the help of some other inmates and his girlfriend. And I mean really, what says innocent more than a secret inmate collab and a getaway car? It seems like his accomplice helped to remove his handcuffs and then he had some twin brothers distract a guard and give him a signal for when to make a run for it. He then slipped out of a fire exit and ran to the getaway car where his girlfriend had a change of clothes for him and they drove off in a flash. This was a very high profile case considering what he was on trial for and caused a huge manhunt across Florida with SWAT teams and helicopters roaming the city all hours of the day. He was missing for a week but thankfully was found. Now back in custody, he faces a potential life sentence with the death penalty for his crimes, although he still maintains his innocence in the entire ordeal. And last up in our number 1 spot, Ted Bundy. Ah yes, the notorious and downright evil killer who needs no introduction. But despite being convicted of killing and committing other horrors to at least 30 women, he was granted way more independence than should have been allowed to someone of his security level. People felt he was very charming and seemed to conveniently forget what he was in custody for. Well, Bundy took advantage of that, and in June of 1977, while on trial for one of his many killings, he was left alone in a courtroom library to prepare, as he was representing himself in court. While alone and out of sight from the guards, Bundy managed to open a window and make a run for it. He jumped out of the second-story window, injuring his ankle, and managed to disappear into the woods for 6 days. He was, of course, found, convicted, and eventually sentenced to death for all of his crimes, but it's one of the craziest escape stories to this day.